Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's product training webinar. We are excited to have Dr. Benjamin Bickman as today's presenter. Dr. Benjamin Bickman, PhD, is currently an assistant professor at Brigham Young University and current director of the Unicity Scientific Advisory Board. Dr. Bickman earned his PhD in bioenergetics and was a postdoctoral fellow at the Duke National University of Singapore in metabolic disorders. Currently, his professional focus as a scientist and professor is to better understand chronic modern-day diseases with an emphasis on the origins and consequences of metabolic disorders, including obesity and diabetes. Dr. Bickman.
Hello, and good day to any who may be listening to this later. I am delighted to participate in this webinar. I think it's a great way to provide some training and what I would consider some essential information, especially regarding the new products, LC Base and Umiate Fuel. And I'm delighted again, as I mentioned, to be able to speak with you about this for a few minutes. Now, some of the justification for these products and the Activate program in general comes from this idea of really tapping into or leaning into the truth of our metabolic evolution. In our history as a species, we, of course, have had to deal with times of feast and famine. And this means our bodies needed to develop the ability to both store energy and use energy. In particular, use the energy that it has stored. This creates this kind of dynamic and very beneficial, indeed necessary cycle, or a metabolic cycle, if you will, of being able to shift through these metabolic states, these very opposite, paradoxical metabolic states, storing the energy versus using the energy when necessary. And when I'm talking about energy, I'm really speaking about the how the body can fuel itself. And in particular, there are two metabolic fuels. There are carbohydrates, which are when consumed, will be used in the body as a carbohydrate called glucose. And then there's fat, and fat comes in countless forms, unlike glucose. All carbohydrate, as it's used, will be broken down to glucose, or blood sugar, as it's commonly called. And then the fats are too many to mention. And I'll mention some specific ones in a bit. But this ability to flux, if you will, or to shift between these two fuels is also referred to as a state of metabolic flexibility. In other words, we can, our metabolic function is able to both rely on glucose when necessary and rely on fat when necessary. And in particular, what happens in a healthy person is when they eat a conventional meal that's going to have carbohydrate in it, the body will use that glucose. It will burn it. The body has a fairly limited ability to store glucose. And then when the person's not eating in a period of fasting, the person will shift their metabolism to rely predominantly on fat. Unfortunately, we have stuck the gears, if you will, where we are pretty much locked into a sugar burning mode or a carbohydrate burning. And even during fasting, if someone is metabolically inflexible, they have a hard time shifting fuels. And so they're still trying to burn glucose and rather than start relying on the fat, in many instances, the fat that they have stored. This is almost entirely a result of the hormone insulin. In particular, if the hormone insulin is stuck in an elevated state, the person is stuck in sugar burning. So in order to be metabolically flexible, to be able to shift between the fuels, insulin has to be able to go down to fairly low levels, which it will do in a healthy person. Unfortunately, if someone's eating the standard American diet, as you can see here, insulin is essentially high all the time. And as insulin is elevated chronically, it creates this situation called insulin resistance, where there are myriad health consequences, as you see indicated here. And they can range from very minor, like craving more carbohydrate and having low energy, to, in fact, quite severe, with weight gain being the least of the person's problems. Now, let's talk briefly about the biochemistry of and the relevance of insulin in fuel use. So in the blood, if a person has eaten a carbohydrate, that will be broken down, depending on the carbohydrate, potentially into a great deal of glucose. Like, for example, bread. That will be broken down, metabolized or digested into a tremendous amount of glucose. The body must clear that glucose from the blood. In fact, it's lethal if the blood glucose levels stay elevated for too long. So insulin sort of swoops in to save the person, metabolically speaking. In this case, what insulin does is it essentially opens the doors to countless cells in the body, most especially the muscle cells and the fat cells, and even brain to a degree. And it opens the door and allows glucose, it ushers glucose in from the blood, where it can't stay at an elevated state for too long, it's dangerous, from the blood into the tissues to be used ideally. However, if there is a great deal of glucose, not only the fat cells actually have an ability to shift some of that glucose into fat, but also importantly, we always have fat circulating in our blood, always, at any point. And as insulin is high for too long, it also starts telling the fat cells to take that fat in and store it, because it can't use the fat, because it needs to use the glucose. Again, because we have such a finite capacity to keep the glucose in the blood and even to store glucose in our tissues. So if we've eaten a lot of glucose, insulin starts to push it out of the blood to store some of the glucose as glycogen, and then to turn some of it to fat, and to start storing any fat in our blood as fat in our fat cells. Now, again, insulin is the key here. And if insulin is high, the body, as I said earlier, is stuck in that sugar or glucose burning mode. And so whatever fat cells are there and potentially loaded with fat, remember that this fat is a fuel for the body, but we just can't use it if insulin is elevated. We're stuck. We're metabolically inflexible. Now, one good analogy that I like to use, and I've used this in the past, is thinking of our bodies as a fuel tanker. And so that's this big truck that's lumbering down the road. You've all seen them, of course. What's important about this is that there are two fuel tanks on this truck. There's this huge one that you can obviously see. And again, it's filled to the brim with fuel. But this truck, interestingly, can't use that fuel. It can only use that little bit of fuel stored in that little tank towards the front, next to the cab that you can see. And this is like on the body, comparing fat to carbohydrate. On the human body, we have, in a normal, lean, healthy person, normal weight, they have about 100 times more fat or energy in the form of stored fat as opposed to stored carbohydrate. And the tragedy in this situation, just like this truck, is most people can't use that fat. So in the case of this truck, because all of his fuel is coming from that small little fuel tank, he will have to stop every few hours and fill it back up, fill it back up, fill it back up. The tragedy, of course, being in particular that if he could simply tap into that massive fuel source at the back that is so obvious, he'd be able to, go across the country. Now, just like on the body, we have the very obvious fuel source of fat, and we have a very hidden, small fuel source, mostly in the form of glycogen, stored glucose in our liver, and that's the carbohydrate. Now, in the body, like with this truck, if insulin is low, that allows us to shift around these fuel lines, these fuel pipes, so that the engine can, in fact, be fueled by fat rather than just carbohydrate. But again, lowering insulin is the key. So this would be an average, in fact, not even an average person right here. In this instance, we have someone only eating 3 meals per day, which again is not average anymore. Too often people are told to eat 5 or 6 times a day, and that's ridiculous advice. So in this case, the person's eating 3 carb-heavy meals per day, which again is better than most people do. And we can see the blood glucose levels going up and down. This is like that truck having to fuel up and then use that fuel from that small little gas tank throughout the day. In other words, metabolically, we have to stop every so often and fill the tank. Tragically, what's happening, and indeed part of why we need to have these frequent fuel stops, is because insulin is staying elevated. By spiking insulin so often with these carb-heavy meals, we're never allowed to shift fuel sources. We're stuck in this sugar-burning mode and thus constantly requiring to fill it up. That's why the person can have so frequent sugar cravings. It's because that small little fuel tank, the glucose starts to get a little low, and then they feel like they need to top it up. But of course, they're swimming in a sea of energy. That's what all of our stored body fat is. This metabolic inflexibility is sometimes referred to as the metabolic syndrome. But the metabolic syndrome is at its core nothing more than the insulin resistance syndrome. So if you've ever heard the term metabolic syndrome, I bet you have, know that before it was called the metabolic syndrome, it was called by scientists and physicians the insulin resistance syndrome. And then we just came up with a better title for it. Metabolic syndrome just sounds a little better. Now, what can we do? If we're stuck in this sugar burning mode and going through these constant cycles, we need to become metabolically flexible. This overall concept is nothing new at Unicity. Unicity has a tradition of focusing on metabolic health, and we're just really emphasizing more recently the need to be able to shift between fuels, to be able to break off from glucose burning and then use fat. Again, if you can't use fat for fuel, any body fat that you have stored is going to stick around far longer and in far greater quantities than any of us actually want. But again, this isn't something new. Existing products within Unicity has focused on this. We're just focusing on it more deliberately now. And so with metabolic flexibility, as I mentioned, we can fuel the body with both carbohydrate that we eat and fat that we eat and that we store. To really take advantage of this, we are promoting an awareness of the key Unicity nutrition principles as indicated. Prioritizing protein, fuel the body with fat, be smart and control carbohydrates, and then give the body breaks with frequency of food consumption. So with prioritized protein, we need protein. I actually don't refer to protein as a fuel, and I don't believe that it should be considered even as a calorie. Now that's me speaking as a bioenergetic scientist. Protein is not metabolized the same way as any other nutrient is. So don't consider protein as a fuel. Consider protein as a building block. We must have it to maintain lean mass. And by lean mass, I don't just mean muscle, but even bone. If it weren't for all of the protein in our bones would be like chalk. They'd be very hard, but very brittle. The protein, as it's mingled in with this, the matrix of minerals, allows the bone to have some flexibility. So it can be hard and strong. So with protein, it's hard to overeat protein, and there are theories about human nutrition that you will be driven to continue to eat until you get enough protein. And depending on the person and their activity level and their overall body composition, this is typically going to be around 1 to 1.5 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. So you need to make sure you're getting enough protein. That's why we start with this concept of prioritizing protein. Next, fuel with fat simply means that we're putting the body in a position to use fat as a primary fuel source. And I'll touch on this in a moment, but part of this involves, in fact, eating fat, not being afraid of fat. So much of our diet these days is fat phobic. You look through the grocery aisles and you'll see that it's fat-free this or low-fat that. We want to go back to more of an evolutionary, ancestral focus by emphasizing the relevance of fat in the diet. again, in part by helping the body remember how to use fat for fuel. And then control carbohydrates. This is not a call to avoid all carbohydrates, not at all. It is rather to simply be smart about them and scrutinize the nutrient density, that if you're going to have carbohydrates, make sure that they are the most nutritious carbohydrates. For example, leafy green, cruciferous vegetables and berries, as opposed to bread, for example, let alone any, of course, kinds of treats. So scrutinize the nutrient to carbohydrate ratio, nothing that formal, of course, but just make sure that the carbohydrate is real, that it's not processed. Essentially, if it's, as I will sometimes say, if it comes in a bag or a box with a barcode, it's probably a carbohydrate you should avoid. And then independent of any of these macronutrients, protein, carbohydrate, fat, is the concept of just when you eat. This is the Unicity principle of 4-4-12, where you have a minimum of 4 hours between breakfast to lunch and then lunch to dinner, and then a minimum of 12 hours from dinner to breakfast the next day. This can shift around a little bit, but on the right side of the screen, you'll see some of the examples. Now, I'm sort of revealing my hand before I've actually introduced the product here, but you can see here are some ways people can utilize these new products with Umiate fuel and LC base, sprinkling them into this 4-4-12 concept. Frankly, I'm an advocate of the top one, or rather, I personally adhere to the top one. I like to have a small breakfast, and by helping keep my insulin in control, I can prolong the fat burning stage that has started overnight. And because when most people wake up in the morning, of course, insulin is low, they haven't been eating overnight, ideally, and they're in a pretty strong state of fat burning. I like to keep that going. But you'll find what works for you, and here are some options. Now, speaking of fat burning, we want to emphasize this concept of the fat burning zone, which is essentially you keeping track of how you are metabolically, that you have been adhering to a diet and, well, the nutrition principles that I've just outlined in such a way and so consistently that you are in this state of fat burning. There are numerous benefits to this, not only just you using your own fat and your body fat getting lower, but people notice cognitive benefits, including so-called energy, so you're more alert, you're focused, you have a greater inclination just to be active and busy, and again, many, many other benefits. So the fat burning zone is simply the term we're giving to this state of having a good low level of insulin and maintaining metabolic flexibility in such a way that you can rely on your own fat for fuel. So now you know, with these key nutritional principles, prioritize protein, fuel with fat, control carbohydrates, and then utilizing these macronutrient matters in a fasting scheme with intermittent fasting, you are putting yourself in a position to be very metabolically flexible. Now, as I mentioned in the past, this is nothing new necessarily within Unicity's focus as a metabolic health company. But we really want to emphasize all of these concepts now. And so I am genuinely thrilled to be able to discuss these products. It's something that is deeply gratifying for me as a scientist to be able to have played a part in, to whatever degree. So often in science, if you'll allow me to share a personal moment, all that happens with us is we have an idea, a hypothesis, we conduct some experiments, and the most we can hope for is that we see data that are statistically significant, and then we get them published in a paper that no one will ever read and no one ever cares about. And so there's nothing ever very practical, let alone actually tangible, from the work that we do. But for me, and my focus as a bioenergetic scientist or a metabolic scientist, this does represent, in fact, something tangible from scientific principles. So with all of that as a preamble and introduction, let's speak about the first one, the big one, LC base. LC base is built with these concepts in mind. Indeed, all of the macronutrient Unicity principles are encompassed within this one product. It has a very low controlled carbohydrate quantity. It has emphasized this protein, and I'll speak more about this in a moment. And it has provided a wide range or a broad spectrum of dietary fats that have, in and of themselves, benefits independent of the promoting the body's ability to remember how to use fat as a fuel, because it is indeed something we're born with, and then our modern diets essentially kick that out of us. Now, some of the features and the benefits: it is in fact calorically loaded enough. It has enough energy to be considered a full meal replacement. So that's why in that model I showed you earlier of utilizing these new products in a 4-4-12, you can in fact have this for breakfast or lunch or dinner and know you've gotten enough calorie. It is a meal. It has the absolute best absorbable proteins. So you know that as you eat this protein, it's going to be readily digested and absorbed from your gut into your blood. And then those amino acids they're giving you the essential amino acids that you need, not only for health, but also for lean mass, muscle and bone in particular. The fats, as I said, come from a broad spectrum, including dairy and coconut. And I'll come back to that concept in just a moment. But I like that. As a scientist who's studied dietary fat and even the cellular metabolism of fats, it's neat for me to be able to know that when I'm taking this, I'm getting a very broad spectrum of fat in my diet. And again, fat is something that is indeed essential for humans. And I do mean that. There are such things as essential fats. So we need to make sure these are things we are eating. So all of this, including other benefits that I've not mentioned, results in what is a very well-rounded, strong meal replacement. Now, some of the specific benefits, I'd mentioned some of the fats earlier, and there are hundreds of thousands of different types of fats. It is an extremely complicated field of biochemistry to study the actual effects and metabolism of these fats, but they include, for example, some of the phospholipids from the dairy fats that we have. And these phospholipids are known to benefit normal cellular function in the body essentially from top to bottom. It also has a different range of fats because of the fats from the coconut fat. Lauric acid is a particularly interesting fat because it not only is metabolized differently due to its being considered a medium chain fat, meaning it gets digested and absorbed very differently from the gut into the blood, but it gets more rapidly metabolized, and that's why actually it gets metabolized at such a high rate that it stimulates the liver to create these things called ketones, which I'm not going to get into in too much detail, but suffice it to say, ketones provide a known, viable, and very beneficial fuel for the brain in particular. And so there's this neat cognitive benefit there insofar as the brain really does thrive when it's fueled with ketones. And I'll come back to that concept when I speak about Unicity fuel. And as I mentioned earlier, the protein profile within LC base is very broad, including the branched chain amino acids to support lean mass development. And then we have the trace minerals that are coming from the pink Himalayan salt. So again, as I mentioned, all in all, a very well-rounded product. Now, the base was built with this concept of acknowledging that there are a lot of products that Unicity offers, and they each have a distinct place and a distinct role. And to avoid, I guess, if you will, complicating the product selection when you would take them all, LC Base was built with this idea of actually being a foundation or a base upon which you can build a specific, drink. Depending on what benefit you want and what flavor you want, you can boost the base, as we want to say. It's kind of a clever little phrase to just remind you that add in some of these flavors. If you want Unicity fuel or classic Unicity or rejuvenate, whatever If you want some collagen, a delicious mix, making the berry flavored kind of smoothie almost when you add in the Nasian collagen into LC base. So I encourage you to take advantage of that idea of being able to mix these products. They are built to mix. Now, the next product, Unicity Fuel, what could be my favorite supplement I've ever taken of all time. With Unicity Fuel, what I love about this is that it's combining kind of my two favorite things, which is helping the body be fueled with fat and the genuine benefits of yerba mate. So I was thrilled when Unicity first announced Unicity a few years ago. It was right when I first became a consultant or a member of the Science Advisory Board, and it quickly became my favorite product. And now Unicity Fuel is my favorite. Now, I mentioned some of the benefits very lightly a moment ago in the introductory slide, but the features here are that it's building on the same beneficial foundation with the polyphenols and other molecules, including the chlorogenic acids, theobromine, and I'll speak more about those two in a moment. Antioxidants, including the polyphenols I said, and then a little bit of caffeine. But I consider this kind of a counter to coffee. And some of you might have heard about bulletproof coffee, where people add a little bit of fat into their coffee. To me, this is a bulletproof coffee killer with Unicity Fuel. It serves a cleaner purpose in my mind. Also, some of the benefits, not only those that you're getting from yerba mate, but also the benefits of the specific coconut oil that we've included, and again, the medium chain fats that come from that. So in fact, let's jump into that. So with the Unicity, we've taken the same very pure, powerful yerba mate extract that is entirety or encompassed really in the classic original Unicity. So we have the same process there. There's nothing changed in that concept. We've just simply extended it. So with the chlorogenic acids, this is a very, well, there are studies to show that chlorogenic acids help improve insulin sensitivity. There are studies to show that chlorogenic acids also accelerate lipolysis, or that's the term for fat mobilization. So stimulating fat cells to release the fat more readily and to be used as a fuel. So it stimulates this metabolic shift from glucose to fat. We have studies going on currently, these are unpublished results, to show that at the muscle, the chlorogenic acids are also stimulating a greater production in energy. So it's helping the muscles produce something called ATP a little more. And then another molecule, theobromine, this actually is something often referred to as a bitter alkaloid. And it's interesting to note that it's bitter. I bet you've noticed the bitter flavor. What you might not know is that you actually have bitter taste receptors in your intestines, not your mouth, but in your intestines. And that if you can activate those bitter receptors, and something like theobromine is a good activator, it actually stimulates your insulin sensitivity. Isn't that interesting? So this, even the bitter part of it, which some may turn their nose up at, but I actually have really come to enjoy, even that bitter flavor is a deliberate benefit. And there are benefits beyond the insulin sensitizing effect of the bitter nature of the theobromine. But that's a main one for me as an insulin metabolic scientist. But there are also other cognitive benefits, improving mood and focus. Now, I've mentioned this already, so I'll be brief. The coconut oil enriched with lauric acid is metabolized very differently than the long chain fats that you're getting from the dairy cream, from the dairy fat. And it stimulates, again, the production of ketones, which has known benefits. And indeed, the MCTs goes beyond that even. MCTs also can stimulate metabolic rate. They stimulate this process called mitochondrial uncoupling, which is this really neat, provocative term for just stimulating metabolic rate. Essentially, the mitochondria start producing more energy, or starts burning through fat and glucose a little faster to produce a little more heat. Now, I hope this has been helpful. My priority always when I give a talk for Unicity is to provide sufficiently compelling and yet accurate scientific information so that you can then share some of this information with your friends and family in such a way that it can become part of your story, with these two products in particular. So good luck. And again, I hope you've been able to learn something valuable from this time.